Hello and welcome to Story to Fluency. Today, you will listen to a simple but powerful English story. Please listen carefully. You can listen first, then you can repeat after me. Let's begin. Part 1. My name is Daniel. I was 29 years old. I lived alone in a small apartment in the city. My life was normal, very normal. Every morning, I woke up at 7, I took a shower, I drank cheap coffee, and I went to work. I worked in a small office. Nothing special, just a normal job. Normal people, normal days. But inside, I felt empty. I didn't hate my life, but I didn't love it either. Every day felt the same. One Monday morning, my boss called me into his office. He said, "Daniel, we have to let you go." I asked, "Why?" He said, "It's not personal. The company is cutting costs." Just like that, my job was gone. I walked out of the building with a box in my hands, my cup, my notebook, my old photos, and a very heavy heart. For the first 2 weeks, I stayed at home. I sent resumes, I looked for jobs, but nobody called. My savings were small, very small. One evening, I looked at my wallet. Only $20 left. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I didn't know what else to do. The next day, I decided to walk. I didn't want to stay in my apartment. The walls felt too close. So I walked through the city. I walked past shops. I walked past cafes. I walked past people who looked busy and important. And then I saw him. He was sitting near a small bakery. An old man, very old. He had gray hair, a long, worn coat, and shoes that were almost falling apart. In front of him, there was a small paper cup. It was empty. He was not asking for money. He was just sitting there, looking at the ground. I walked past him, then I stopped. I don't know why. Something in my chest felt heavy. I turned around and looked at him again. He looked tired. Not just no sleep tired, but life tired. I walked back to him. I said, "Sir, are you hungry?" He slowly looked up at me. His eyes were very calm, very deep. He said, "Yes, a little." I looked at my wallet, $20. That was all I had. I said, "Wait here, I'll be back." I went into the bakery. I bought 2 pieces of bread, 2 cups of hot tea. When I came back, he was still there. I gave him the food. He looked at me for a few seconds. Then he said, "Thank you, young man." His voice was quiet, but strong. We sat there. We ate in silence. After a few minutes, he said, "You look like someone who is also lost." I smiled a little. I said, "Maybe I am." He looked at me and said, "Sometimes, when you lose everything, you find something else." I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. Then he stood up. He picked up his old bag. He looked at me and said, "Thank you for the food. I will not forget this." I said, "It's nothing." But he looked at me in a strange way. And then he said something very strange. He said, "You and I will meet again." I watched him walk away. I don't know why, but I felt like my life had just changed. End of part 1. Part 2. The strange meeting begins. 3 days passed. I almost forgot about the old man. Life was still hard. No job, no calls, no good news. Every morning I checked my email. Nothing. One afternoon, I went out to walk again, not because I wanted to, but because my apartment felt too quiet, too empty. I walked without thinking, and without knowing it, I walked to the same street, the same bakery, the same place. He was there, sitting in the same spot, the same old coat, the same old bag. But this time, in front of him, there was no cup. He was just sitting and watching people. I walked closer. He saw me, and he smiled. He said, "You came back." I said, "Yes, I guess I did." We sat together again. He did not ask for food, but I still went and bought 2 teas. When I came back, he said, "You don't have much money, but you still share." I was surprised. I said, "How do you know?" He smiled. He said, "Because your eyes are like mine." We drank tea. Then he asked, "Tell me, Daniel, what did you lose?" I said, "My job, my direction, my confidence." He nodded slowly. He said, "Good." I said, "Good?" He said, "Yes. When a man loses everything, he becomes free." I did not answer. After a short silence, he asked, "Do you believe in chance?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Good. Then listen carefully." He opened his bag. Inside there was a very clean, very expensive-looking notebook that did not match his clothes. He gave it to me. He said, "Tomorrow morning, go to this address." I looked at the first page. There was only one thing written: Riverside Building, 9 a.m. I said, "What is this?" He said, "An opportunity." I said, "For what?" He said, "For a new life." I laughed. I said, "Are you serious?" He looked at me, and suddenly his eyes were not the eyes of a poor old man. They were sharp, strong, dangerously calm. He said, "Daniel, do you think I sit here because I have no choice?" I did not know what to say. He stood up. He said, "Go to that address, or don't." Then he added, "But if you don't go, your life will stay exactly the same." Then he walked away, again. That night, I could not sleep. I looked at the notebook again and again. Who was he? Was this a joke? Was it a trap? Or was it something real? In the morning, at 8:30, I stood in front of the Riverside Building. End of part 2. Part 3. Inside the Riverside Building. The Riverside Building was tall, very tall, too clean, too quiet. I stood in front of the glass doors for a long time. Then I took a deep breath and went inside. The lobby was huge, white walls, shiny floor, no noise. Behind a big desk, a young woman was sitting. She looked at me and smiled. She said, "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" I said, I think so." I showed her the notebook. She looked at the address written inside. Her smile changed, just a little. She picked up the phone. She said, "Yes, he is here." He? Who was he? 2 men in black suits came. They did not smile. They said, "Please follow us, sir." We walked through long hallways, many doors, no names on the doors, no windows. They stopped in front of a big dark door. One of them knocked. A voice from inside said, "Send him in." The room was large, very large. There was a big table, big windows, and one man standing near the window. He was tall, straight, strong. He slowly turned around. It was the old man, but not really. He was clean, perfect suit, expensive watch, new shoes. His hair was still gray, but now he looked powerful, very powerful. I could not speak. He smiled and said, "Good morning, Daniel." I said, "You?" He said, "Yes." I sat down. My hands were shaking. I said, "Who are you?" He looked at me and said, "My name is Victor Hale." Then he added, "And I own this building." My head was empty. I said, "But you were—" He finished my sentence. "Sitting on the street?" He smiled. He said, "Yes." He sat across from me. He said, "I test people." I said, "Test?" He said, "I wanted to see what kind of man you are when you think nobody is watching." He looked at me and said, "You shared your last money with a stranger." Then he said, "That tells me more than any resume." He stood up and walked to the window. He said, "I am very rich, Daniel." He turned back. He said, "But I am very careful." Then he said something that shocked me. He said, "I am looking for someone to take my place." End of part 3. Part 4. The first truth. I thought I did not hear him correctly. I said, "Take your place?" He looked at me calmly. He said, "Yes." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was crazy. I said, "You don't even know me." He said, "I know enough." He sat down again. He said, "Daniel, do you know how many people want my money?" I said, "I can imagine." He said, "Everyone wants what I have, but nobody wants what I do." He pressed a button on his desk. A big screen turned on. There were numbers, buildings, maps, companies. He said, "This is my world." Then he looked at me and said, "And it is very dangerous." I said, "Why me?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Because you were kind when you thought it did not matter." He stood up and walked slowly. He said, "I have a family." He stopped. Then he said, "Or I had." His voice became quieter. He said, "My son wants my empire." He turned around. He said, "But he is not a good man." I felt something cold in my chest. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "He lies. He destroys. He does not care who gets hurt." He looked at me and said, "If he takes my place, many people will suffer." The room was very quiet. He said, "I do not have much time." I said, "So you want a stranger to replace you?" He said, "I want a good man to replace me." He walked back to his desk. He opened a file. Inside, there was my name, my photo, my history. I stood up. I said, "You were watching me?" He said, "Yes, for 3 months." My heart was beating fast. He said, "You passed the first test without knowing it." Then he said, "And now the real tests begin." End of part 4. Part 5. The Sun. Victor Hale closed the file. He looked at me and said, "Before any tests, you must meet him." I said, "Meet who?" He said, "My son." The door opened. A man walked in. He was about my age, maybe a little older. Perfect suit, perfect hair, cold eyes. He smiled, but his smile was empty. Victor said, "Daniel, this is my son, Richard." Richard looked at me. He said, "So, you are the street hero." I did not like his voice. He sat down without asking. He looked at his father. He said, "So, this is your new game? Poor people again?" Victor said, "Be quiet." Richard laughed. He looked at me and said, "You know he is using you, right?" I said nothing. Richard stood up and walked around me. He said, "Do you know how many men like you come here?" He looked at his father. He He said, "And do you know how many of them disappear?" The room became cold. Victor said, "Enough." Richard smiled. He said, "Good luck, Daniel." Then he stopped near me and whispered, "If you fail, don't worry. I will take care of you." He left. I looked at Victor. I said, "He hates you." Victor said, "He wants my power." Then Victor said, "Your first test is simple." He gave me a small folder. He said, "There is a man in this file." He looked at me and said, "He stole money from my company." I said, "So you want me to report him?" Victor said, "No." He said, "I want you to decide what happens to him." End of part 5. Part 6. The file. I opened the folder. Inside, there were photos. A man, about 40 years old. A wife. 2 children. A small house. Victor said, "His name is Mark Lewis." He paused. He moved money. Not a lot, but enough. I said, "Did he steal it?" Victor said, "Yes." Then he added, "But he did it to pay for his daughter's surgery." I looked at him. I said, "So you already know the reason?" Victor said, "Yes." I said, "So what is the test?" Victor said, "The test is you." He said, "If I destroy him, my company becomes stronger." He said, "If I forgive him, others will do the same." He looked at me and said, "Power is choosing who pays the price." I felt sick. I said, "What does your son want?" Victor smiled. A cold smile. He said, "He wants you to destroy the man." Then Victor said, "Richard already sent his people." I said, "Then why ask me?" Victor said, "Because I want to see if you are different." That night, I went to Mark's house. I did not know why. I just went. His house was small, but warm. I saw the light inside. I knocked. Mark opened the door. He looked scared when he saw me. I said, "I am not here to hurt you." We sat at his table. He told me everything. He cried. A grown man crying. He said, "If they take me to court, my family is finished." When I left, I knew something. This was not a test. This was a trap. End of part 6. Part 7. The decision. I did not sleep that night. I walked around my apartment. I thought about Mark. I thought about his children. I thought about Victor. I thought about Richard. In the morning, I went back to the Riverside building. Victor was already waiting. He said, "Did you make your decision?" I said, "Yes." I put the folder on his desk. I said, "Let him go." Victor looked at me. He did not smile. He did not get angry. He just looked. He said, "And if others do the same?" I said, "Then fix the system, not destroy the people." The room was quiet. Then Victor said, "Good." He picked up the phone. He said, "Stop everything. The case is closed." A few seconds later, the phone rang again. Victor listened. Then his face changed. He slowly put the phone down. He looked at me and said, "My son did not listen." My heart started beating fast. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "He already sent the police." At that moment, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered. A man said, "We have Mark Lewis." I looked at Victor. Victor closed his eyes. He said, "Richard is starting a war." Part 8. The Chase. Victor stood up very fast. He said, "They will not take him to a normal police station." I said, "Then where?" Victor said, "To one of Richard's places." He pressed a button. 2 men in black suits came in. He said, "Find him, now." Then he looked at me. He said, "You are coming with me." We went down to the underground garage. Black cars, dark windows. Everything felt unreal. Inside the car, Victor said, "This is how my son works." He said, "He creates problems, then sells the solution." I said, "And the police?" Victor said, "Some of them belong to him." My phone rang. A message. An address. Victor looked at it. He said, "They want you to come alone." I said, "I will go." Victor said, "No." I said, "Yes." He looked at me. Then he said, "They are testing you again." The car stopped 2 streets away from the address. An old warehouse. No lights, no people. I walked to the door. My heart was loud, very loud. The door opened, and Richard was waiting inside. End of Part 8. Part 9. The Offer. The warehouse was cold, empty. Only one light was on. Richard was standing under it. He was smiling. He said, "You came alone. Good." I said, "Where is Mark?" Richard said, "He is safe, for now." He walked closer. He said, "You are brave, or stupid." I said, "Let him go." Richard laughed. He said, "Why?" He looked at me and said, "Because of him?" He pointed up. He said, "My father is a dinosaur." Then he said something that shocked me. He said, "He is already dying." I said, "What?" Richard said, 6 months, maybe less." My head started spinning. He said, "That is why he is looking for a replacement." Then Richard said, "But you don't have to be his puppet." He walked around me. He said, "Join me." I said, "No." He smiled. He said, "I will give you half of everything." I said, "I don't want your money." Richard's eyes became cold. He said, "You are making a mistake." Then he said, "If you refuse, Mark goes to prison. His family is finished." I said, "And if I accept?" Richard said, "Then you and I run this empire together." At that moment, I understood something. This was not about Mark. This was about me. End of Part 9. Part 10. The Choice. I looked at Richard. I said, "Let Mark go, then we can talk." Richard laughed. He said, "You are not in a position to negotiate." He snapped his fingers. 2 men brought Mark in. His face was hurt, but he was alive. Mark looked at me. His eyes were full of fear. He said, "They said you could help." I felt something break inside me. I looked at Richard. I said, "If I agree, you let him go?" Richard said, "Yes." I was quiet for a long time. Then I said, "Okay." Richard smiled. He said, "Smart choice." He told his men, "Take Mark and drop him near his house." They took Mark away. Mark looked back at me. I nodded. Now we were alone. Richard walked closer. He said, "Welcome to the real world, Daniel." Then he said something quietly, "And now you belong to me." At that moment, I knew I had just made a deal with the devil. End of part 10. Part 11. Two Masters. The next day, I was back in the Riverside building, but this time, everything felt different. People looked at me differently. Doors opened faster. Voices became quieter. Richard walked next to me like we were friends. He said, "You see, power is easy." Inside Victor's office, the air was heavy. Victor was sitting. He looked tired, very tired. He looked at me. He said, "You chose to save the man." I said, "Yes." Then he said, "But you made a deal with my son." I froze. I said, "How do you know?" Victor smiled sadly. He said, "This is my building." He stood up slowly. He said, "You think you can play both sides." He walked closer. He said, "Be careful, Daniel." Richard laughed. He said, "Father, you should rest." Then Victor looked at him. Then he looked at me. He said, "Now your real test begins." That evening, Victor's assistant gave me a new file. She said, "Mr. Hale wants you to handle this personally." I opened it, and my blood went cold. Inside was a photo of me. End of part 11. Part 12. The Past. I stared at the file. My name, my photo, my old address, things I never told anyone here. I said, "What is this?" The assistant said, "Mr. Hale said you should read it alone." I went to my new office. Yes, I had an office now. Big, quiet, too expensive. I opened the file. Inside was my whole life, my school, my old jobs, my mistakes. And then I saw something that made my hands shake. A police report. 10 years ago. A fight. A man was hurt. Badly. I remembered that night. I was young, angry, stupid. The man did not die, but his life was ruined. The file said, "This case can be reopened." My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Richard's voice. He said, "Everyone has a past, Daniel." I said, "What do you want?" He said, "Loyalty." He continued, "My father is watching you," he said, "and so am I." Then he said something that made my stomach turn. He said, "If you ever betray me, this file becomes public." The call ended. I sat in silence. I understood the truth now. I was not a partner. I was a prisoner. And this empire was a cage. End of part 12. Part 13. The Secret. 2 days later, Victor asked to see me. I went to his office. He looked weaker, but his eyes were still sharp. He said, "You saw the file." I said nothing. He said, "My son is not the only monster here." He slowly stood up. He said, "I built this empire with dirty hands." Then he said something I did not expect. He said, "I am not afraid to die." He looked at me. He said, "I am afraid of who will come after me." He opened a drawer. He took out a small black drive. He gave it to me. He said, "This contains everything." I said, "Everything?" He said, "Crimes, names, proof." I looked at him. I said, "Why are you giving this to me?" He said, because you still feel guilt. Then he said, and guilt is the beginning of change. He sat down tired. He said, when the time comes, you must choose. That night, Richard invited me to dinner, a very expensive place. He smiled a lot, too much. He said, soon everything will be ours. And I knew the storm was coming. End of Part 13. Part 14. The Betrayal. 1 week later, Victor did not come to the office. That never happened before. People were nervous, phones were ringing, doors were closing. Richard was calm, too calm. In the afternoon, news came. Victor was in the hospital. Heart attack. I went there. He was lying in a white room. Machines were making quiet sounds. He looked at me. He said, "He did this." I said, "Richard?" Victor slowly nodded. He said, "He is moving faster than I thought." That evening, Richard called a big meeting. He stood in front of everyone. He said, "My father is very sick." He paused. Then he said, "So I will take control." People clapped. I did not. Later, Richard came to me. He smiled. He said, "You see, things are changing." Then he whispered, "And you are with me, or under me." I went home that night. I could not sleep. I looked at the black drive in my hand, and I knew there was no more time. End of Part 14. Part 15. The First Move. The next morning, I did not go to the office. Instead, I went to a small internet cafe. No cameras, no names. I took out the black drive. I plugged it in. Inside were hundreds of files, videos, recordings, bank transfers, names, big names. My hands were cold. This was not just one company. This was a network. I made copies, many copies. I hid them in different places. Then I sent one message, only one, to one journalist. That evening, the news exploded. Richard called me. He was not smiling. He said, "What did you do?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "People are asking questions." I said, "Good." He was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "You are dead." I hung up. For the first time, I was not afraid. End of Part 15. Part 16. The Hunt. The next day, I could not go home. 2 black cars were already waiting near my building. My phone kept ringing, unknown numbers. I turned it off. I moved from place to place, cheap hotels, busy streets, no patterns. On the news, they talked about anonymous leaks. Richard's company name was mentioned, not directly, not yet. That night, I got a message from Victor. Only 2 words. Be careful. I did not know if I could trust him, but I knew one thing. Richard would not stop. In a small hotel room, I heard a noise outside my door. Footsteps. Then silence. I held my breath. Someone tried the door handle once, twice. Then they left. I sat on the bed, shaking. This was not a game anymore. This was a war. Part 17. The Ally. I needed help. Real help. Not Victor. Not anyone from the company. I thought about one person, the man from my past, the one in the file, Mark Lewis. I found his house, the same small house, the same light. He opened the door. When he saw me, he was shocked. He said, "They said you saved me." I said, "I need your help now." He was silent. Then he said, "Come in." He told me something I did not know. He said, "Richard's people came to me too." I said, "What did they want?" He said, "They wanted to know where you are." He did not tell them. Then he said, "I owe you my life." Mark worked in IT before. He said, "I know how to hide things." That night, we started working. For the first time, I was not alone. Part 18. The Truth About Victor. For 3 days, we did not sleep much. Mark was fast, very fast. He opened files, connections, hidden accounts. Then one night, he looked at me. His face was white. He said, "Daniel, Victor is not a victim." I said, "I know he is not clean." Mark said, "No, it's worse." He turned the screen to me. Victor's name, again and again, but not as a target, as the center. Mark said, "He controls everything." He said, "Richard is dangerous." He paused. "Victor is worse." I felt cold. I said, "Then why give me the drive?" Mark said, "Because he is losing." At that moment, I understood. Victor did not choose me to save the world. He chose me to save himself. End of Part 18. Part 19. Between Two Devils. Now I knew the truth. I was standing between two monsters, Victor and Richard. One wanted to use me. The other wanted to own me. I sent a message to Victor. I wrote, "We need to talk." He answered, "Come alone." At the same time, Richard sent me a message. "I know where you are." My heart started beating faster. I chose neither. Instead, Mark and I made a plan. We would give Victor some of the files, not all. And we would tell Richard something else, a lie. We would make them fight each other. That night, the city felt different, like it was waiting for blood. End of Part 19. Part 20. The Meeting with Victor. I went to see Victor at night. Not in the hospital, not in the office, in a private house near the river. 2 guards checked me. No phone, no watch, no weapons. Victor was sitting in a dark room. Only one lamp was on. He looked older, smaller, but his eyes were still dangerous. He said, "You learned the truth." I said, "Yes." He smiled slowly. He said, "Good, then we can stop pretending." I sat down. I said, "You used me." He said, "Yes." He said, "I needed someone clean." I said, "I am not clean." He said, "You were." He coughed. He said, "My son is trying to kill me." I said, "And you are trying to use me as a shield." He laughed. Then he started coughing again. He said, "Daniel, listen carefully." He pressed a button. The wall opened. Inside was a small room with screens, maps, cameras. He said, "This is the real company." He said, "Richard thinks he is strong." He smiled. "He is not." He turned to me. He said, "I want you to finish this." I said, "By destroying him?" He said, "Yes." I said, "And then?" He said, "Then you take my place." I was silent. He leaned forward. He said, "You already started a war." I said, "You started it." He smiled. He said, "I can protect you." He said, "Or I can destroy you." He put a folder on the table. Inside were new documents about Mark, about me. He said, "You see, I am not your enemy." I stood up. I said, "You are worse." For the first time, his smile disappeared. He said quietly, "Be careful, Daniel. You are not as important as you think." I left the house. My hands were shaking. Outside, my phone turned on. A message from Mark. Another message. Unknown number. "You chose the wrong side." Then, the city lights went out in one whole district. The war had begun. End of part 20. Part 21. The night the city went dark. The power was gone in half of the district. No lights, no traffic signals, no cameras. That was not an accident. That was Richard. I ran, not to hide, to reach Mark. He was in his house, the same small house, too easy to find. I called him, no answer. My heart was beating in my ears. When I arrived, I saw it. The door was broken. Inside, everything was destroyed. Furniture on the floor, the computer was gone. "Mark!" I shouted. No answer. Then I saw blood. Not much, but enough. My phone vibrated. A message from Richard. "You made this personal." Another message, a photo. Mark, tied to a chair, his face was hurt, but he was alive. A third message, an address. I knew it was a trap. I went anyway. The place was an old power station, abandoned, dark. Inside, generators were working, lights from big lamps, men with guns. Richard was waiting. He said, "You are predictable." Mark was there, on his knees, two men behind him. Richard looked at me and said, "This is very simple." He walked closer. He said, "Give me the drive." I said, "You already know I don't have all of it." He smiled. He said, "Then give me what you have." I said, "And if I don't?" He looked at Mark and nodded. One of the men hit Mark hard. Mark cried out. Richard said calmly, "You see, this is business." I felt something inside me break. I said, "Let him go." Richard said, "After you give me the files." I slowly took a small drive from my pocket, not the real one, a copy. I threw it on the floor. Richard picked it up. He smiled. He said, "You learn fast." He nodded. His men untied Mark. They pushed him to me. Richard said, "Run." We ran. Behind us, I heard him shout, "Next time, I won't negotiate." We did not stop until we were far, very far. In a dark street, Mark looked at me. He said, "He will never stop." I said, "I know." And at that moment, I understood something very clear. To win this war, one of them had to die. End of part 21. Part 22. The final plan. We hid in a small motel outside the city. No name, no cameras, no questions. Mark's hands were shaking, not from pain, from fear. He said, "They will find us." I said, "Yes." He looked at me. He said, "So what do we do?" I looked at the wall. at nothing. Then I said, "We stop running." He did not understand. I said, "We end this." That night, we opened everything, all the files, all the copies. We built one package, one digital bomb. If something happened to me, it would go public automatically. Mark said, "So they can't kill you?" I said, "No." I paused. "They still can." Then I said, "But they will fall with me." The next morning, I sent 2 messages. To Victor, "I know everything. We meet tonight." To Richard, "Your father is going to sell you out. I have proof." Then I turned off my phone. Mark looked at me. He said, "You are crazy." I smiled. I said, "Maybe." That evening, I went back to the city, alone. First, I went to see Victor. He was in a new place, more guards, more walls. He looked at me and said, "You are late." I said, "You are dying." He smiled. He said, "So are you." I put a drive on the table. I said, "This is your whole life." He did not touch it. I said, "Your son is coming." For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. I said, "He thinks you will betray him." Victor stood up. He said, "He is wrong." I said, "He is just like you." He looked at me, long. Then he said quietly, "What do you want?" I said, "Both of you exposed." He laughed. He said, "You think you are the hero?" I said, "No." I said, "I am the consequence." At that moment, the door opened. Richard walked in with a gun. He was smiling. He said, "Family meeting." End of part 22. Part 23. 3 men in one room. The room became very quiet, too quiet. Richard was holding the gun. Victor was standing near the table. I was between them. Richard said, "Well, this is beautiful." He looked at his father. He said, "You were going to sell me." Victor said calmly, "You sold yourself a long time ago." Richard laughed. He said, "And you chose this nobody instead of me?" Victor looked at me. Then he said, "I chose a mirror." Richard's eyes became dark. He pointed the gun at Victor. He said, "You always wanted control." Then he pointed the gun at me. He said, "And you are just a tool." I said, "You are both finished." Richard laughed. He said, "Not today." He took a step closer. At that moment, Victor said quietly, "He already sent the files." Richard's hand was shaking. He said, "You are lying." I said, "Check your phone." His phone vibrated. He looked. His face changed. He whispered, "No." Suddenly, the windows exploded. Glass everywhere. Men in black came in. Someone shouted, "Police!" Chaos, shouting, guns. Richard tried to run. Victor grabbed him. Richard turned and hit his father. They both fell. I stood there, not moving. 2 policemen grabbed Richard. Another one grabbed Victor. Richard was screaming, "You did this! You!" Victor was quiet. He looked at me one last time, and he smiled. Not a kind smile, a proud one. End of part 23. Part 24. The world finds out. The next morning, the news was everywhere. Every channel, every site, every phone. Names, companies, photos, videos. People were shocked. Some were angry. Some were scared. Victor Hale, Richard Hale, their empire. Everything was falling. In court, Richard was loud. He was angry. He blamed everyone. Victor was quiet, very quiet. When it was my turn to speak, the room was silent. I told them everything, from the old man to the bakery to the files. People looked at me like I was not real. Mark was there too. He testified. Weeks passed. Victor was sentenced. So was Richard. Different prisons. The empire was broken into pieces. One evening, I was sitting alone in my old apartment. Yes, my old one. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. A voice said, "You think this is over?" The line went dead. I looked at the wall and I knew. Some stories never really end. End of part 24. Part 25. Final. The Man on the Street. After the trial, I tried to live a normal life. Again, I found a small job. Not important, not powerful, quiet. I moved to a smaller apartment. No guards, no black cars, no secrets. For a while, things were peaceful. But sometimes at night, I still heard Richard's voice. I still saw Victor's eyes. One evening, I was walking through the city. The same streets, the same noise, the same people. And then I saw him. An old man, sitting near a small bakery, a paper cup in front of him, empty. He looked tired, not no sleep tired, but life tired. I stopped. For a moment, I just stood there, looking at him. Then I walked to the bakery. I bought 2 pieces of bread, 2 cups of hot tea. I came back. I gave him the food. He looked up at me. His eyes were calm, deep. He said, "Thank you, young man." We sat in silence. After a few minutes, he said, "You look like someone who has seen too much." I smiled a little. I said, "Maybe I have." He said, "Life is strange." I nodded. Then he said something that made my heart stop for 1 second. He said, "Sometimes one small kindness can change everything." I looked at him, and in that moment, I finally understood. This story was never about money. It was never about power. It was about one choice, one simple choice. I stood up. I said, "Take care." He said, "You too." I walked away, and for the first time in many years, I felt light, free. Because now I knew, no matter how dark the world becomes, you can always choose to be a good man. The end.